My INP is The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. It begins with Esperanza, the protagonist, moving into her first home after living in an apartment. After discovering what the new home is like compared to her dreams of a very lavish house, she starts to dislike the new house due to it being run down and crowded. Esperanza eventually starts disliking the home, and as she grows up a little bit, she begins to realize how terrible the house is and how she wants to live in a bigger, better house. She lives in a poor area where the Hispanics are looked down upon the other neighborhoods. And not only that, but also wives are beaten and trapped inside their homes by their overprotective husbands. The rising action begins when Esperanza begins to hit puberty and starts making new friends. She eventually begins falling in love with boys and eventually realizes the true circumstances of what happens during Mango Street. Eventually, her and her friends make a pact to where they are to leave together and not alone in order to prevent something terrible to happen to them, such as rape or kidnapping. Eventually, Esperanza also realizes that she wants to move out when she's done to live in a new, lavish lifestyle by herself. Eventually, the climax begins with Esperanza and her one friend Sally going to an amusement park where Sally starts hitting on other boys and eventually leaves Esperanza alone. Esperanza, worried about being there, begins to walk home, where a couple of teenage boys begin to escort her home, at which she eventually wakes up the next day confused, realizing that she was raped. The falling action begins when Esperanza grows up fully, goes to a funeral, where three older sisters say that they can make her escape Mango Street if she promises to return. Esperanza declines the offer. She does not want to return, and she eventually leaves without telling anyone. Eventually, she begins to want to come back after forgetting where she came from and wants to help the people trapped there anyways. She eventually comes back, and that's when the resolution happens, to where Esperanza eventually returns and helps the families return and be safe. So my project is a pamphlet about the poverty in the United States and how it affects many of Americans in our country. So it talks about how the poverty rate is extremely high in our country, about what it's like to live in poverty, and such like that. So the first page of the pamphlet is poverty affects nearly 17.3 million people in the United States alone. Mainly in urban areas, poverty prevents families from living a typical American lifestyle. Poverty is defined by the income of a household by the number of people living inside of a household. An example is a household of 4 people who are in poverty when the income is less than $25,701. Urban areas are the most affected by poverty due to the difficulties of finding work in the sometimes harsh environments in the inner city zone. Living in a city like Chicago, New York City, or Los Angeles in the inner city can be really rough due to the insanely crowded areas and the lack of work. It can be really hard to find jobs and to help support a family. The second page discusses about the ethnicities affected by poverty, because a lot of times Native Americans, African Americans, and Hispanics are the ones most affected by poverty due to the fact of neglect by society. Third page discusses the poverty mainly in the United States. It's a little visual of it. Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, and St. Louis, Missouri, the cities most affected by poverty due to the lack of jobs, because they were in the Rust Belt and they were run down after the Industrial Revolution. Life under poverty is really bad. You can be really homeless and people will ignore you and refuse to help you due to the fact that the stigma of them being weak or useless to society shows them looked down upon heavily. People are usually murdered by police due to the fact that the police thinks that they are bad people. It is really common, such as the recent events in Minnesota. Not only that, but also poverty can affect millions of Americans too every day due to the fact that they just unable to find jobs, and it sucks really bad. Correlation between the House on Mango Street and poverty. The House on Mango Street is a story about a girl living in poverty and how it affects the lifestyle of her life compared to a typical American. That is why I chose to write the pamphlet about poverty in the United States, because in the House on Mango Street, millions of people are affected by poverty just like in real life. And Esperanza is one of the millions of people who are affected, as she lives in a rundown neighborhood, eventually gets raped by bad teenagers, and has to find work and has to leave in order to prevent stuff from happening to her, such as murder or rape or kidnapping. And then I have my works cited.